My name's Ahmad Safdar,
And I'm Troy Belcher.
and we're going to have a conversation about what we learned in Dr. Brian Carter's class about the Harlem Renaissance. So to begin it off, I remember we talked about how even though slavery was abolished in 1865, the beginning of the 20th century in the United States still deprived blacks from several rights, freedoms, and opportunities that whites had. And even today, that's still prevalent. But African Americans were seen as inferior. They were thought of by white society as being living creatures with no talent, minimum intellect, a disruptive society, and a skewed social order. African Americans were definitely not content with their situation and the expectations different racial groups had of them. During the first half of the 20th century, African Americans displayed the various strengths and talents that were inside of them that no one ever saw, none of the whites saw, or even expected. And that obviously shocked the white communities and even some black societies. Now, this period was known as the Harlem Renaissance. It was a whole movement of art, literature, music, and everything. It was just a cultural movement. It wasn't solely based on one thing. Um, Even the Harlem Renaissance, or as Alan Locke likes to call it, the New Negro movement, was just an eruption of black talent from all angles, including and not limited to, like I said, art, literature, and even racial pride. Now, the Harlem Renaissance began about 1919 and was fueled by passionate and committed black optimists. Um, so, one of the questions was there was a Negro migration from the South to the North, and many wondered why that happened. So, the Great Depression, World War One, were terrible times for the U.S. And around 1918, they just got out of it, and jobs were opening up everywhere, specifically the Midwest and the northeastern United States. Now, African Americans saw these job opportunities and openings as reasons to move to the North from the South. The North had, even though there was still discrimination and racism present, it was less than the South, or less extreme than the South. And then more than 1 million African Americans migrated to the North looking for jobs, better lives, just a better life, because the North promised them this. Now, this, like I said, had many reasons for this great migration: the job openings, like I said, less racism, and also better and more suitable weather. Because the South has very harsh weather, while the North has calm weather throughout the year. Maybe in the winter it gets a little harsh. But going back to the less racism, lynching was becoming very prevalent in the United States, specifically the South. And African Americans wanted to move to the North for a much safer home. Um, Now, as they moved to the north, one of the Mecca, or where they most of them landed, about 66% of them went to the New York area. Harlem used to be a white neighborhood, and then several churches brought properties, and several African Americans moved to the neighborhood, leading the whites to leave, and the neighborhood becoming prominently African American. Now, many would argue that the Harlem Renaissance was bound to happen because of previous events. The African Americans were fed up with the treatment they were getting, and they wanted something better for themselves and their society and their community. Now, one of these events was the creation of the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was founded in 1909, about almost 11 or 12 years before the Harlem Renaissance actually happened. But It was one of the largest civil rights organizations that were fighting for social justice. Another huge event that happened alongside the NAACP was the creation of the magazine Crisis. Now, the Crisis was a huge magazine that basically pointed out and wanted change. It was like it's kind of a source for change. It was edited by huge figures in the early Harlem Renaissance. For example, W.E.B. Du Bois, and his goal was to reveal the dangers of racial prejudice. One of his publications in 1911 even helped make a push for ban on lynching. Because of Du Bois's use of literature to promote racial changes, he expected every African American who was going to make something artful to have a purpose, and this purpose was for black advancement. He didn't art for art's sake wasn't there. It was art for purpose. Something he wanted something out of it. Art isn't just there to for that reason. And 1917 was also a huge year that impacted I guess, the proliferation or the growth of the Harlem Renaissance. For instance, Marcus Garvey just came home from Jamaica, and he he came home. He came to the United States from Jamaica and founded the UNIA, which is the United Negro Improvement Association, which basically looked to increase the freedoms of those with African history. This was also 1917 was also a year of the St. Louis race riots. Race riots were crazy, where in St. Louis almost 200 or about 200 African Americans were killed by white mobs, and this was just happening. This started these race riots happen throughout the United States. And something interesting that happened was something called the Silent Parade, which was a protest by African Americans, which encompassed actually 10,000 black individuals who marched down the famous Fifth Street protesting against lynching, black violence. And 1917 was also the year The Messenger was created. The Messenger was a very important magazine because it basically shared the different works various African American individuals wrote. Not only that, it also discussed several topics that many other magazines, African American promotion magazines, would be afraid to discuss or talk about. And whites and blacks started tuning in and reading the fantastic works, getting informed. The whites would become informed. Even some blacks would become informed of the tragedies or the hardships that African Americans had to face through the messenger. Now we come into one of the biggest years, year of 1919, where arguably the Harlem Renaissance started. Um, Now, this was the year of the Red Summer. Now, many people, the Red Summer is basically a name given by James Weldon Johnson because of how bloody the summer of 1919 was. Like I said, race riots were occurring everywhere in the United States against black individuals. Some black individuals would even retaliate, and that would kill white individuals. These race riots were basically post-war tension and because of the job competition. Like I said, like African Americans were moving to the north, and some businesses could get hire them and pay them less than white individuals. So black individuals were basically taking the jobs from the whites. This caused tension. Whites didn't seem that it was fair, and and then it led to the Red Summer, these huge race riots. One of the biggest race riots was in Chicago. Event was very tragic. It started out by a boy swimming into a territory claimed by whites. The whites threw stones at him. He drowned, and the black African Americans who were standing around retaliated. It led to a huge riot, war, like kind of like a little war, and martial law was called on the city. Another thing that happened was the 369th Infantry Regiment returning from war. Previously, if African Americans wanted to go to war, they would have to enlist in the Canadian or in the French Canadian or the French infantry. This was the first time we were seeing African Americans being allowed to enter an American war. Um, Now, this regiment they served with the American Expeditionary Force during World War One. They even saw battle during World War Two, and they were very they gained a lot of respect in Europe. The France even awarded them the famous Croix de sorry, what was it called? The um, Croix de Guerre. I don't know how to pronounce it, but that's what France granted them. They were even nicknamed the Hellfighters because of how standing and like they were unstoppable. No one could push them back, and it was a very huge thing for African Americans because it kind of led to African Americans being able to be looked at as soldiers. Now, this was also the year that Claude McKay published one of his most famous poems, If We Must Die, in the Liberator Journal. Now, Claude McKay is considered one of the most influential people of the Harlem Renaissance. Very interesting guy. He was interested a lot in communism, spent time there, but he was still for, yeah, no matter what, he was still for the advancement of African American rights. Now, his poem, If We Must Die, was very powerful and radical in the sense he wasn't afraid to speak his mind. Um, Basically, the poem states that it's okay to fight the whites back so the blacks don't lose their class and freedom. Everything they worked for, the whites are trying to push them back. And he said, no, that isn't okay. Black people are allowed to fight back for this. McKay's influence is most notable in his publication Home to Harlem. In Home to Harlem, we're going to talk about that later, but it was just a great book that he also talked about. And now we're coming to 1920.
Okay, so in 1920, James Weldon Johnson was elected president of the NAACP, and this was a big moment. What's it called? Because James Weldon Johnson has been an author, he's been a lawyer, he's a civil rights activist, he's a jack of a lot of trades, and they really wanted him to get in there and to stop race riots and to promote this anti-lynching that was going on. During 1920 as well, W. Du Bois publishes Dark Tower, which is his biggest literary work in the moments of the Harlem Renaissance, which were pretty important at the time. Also, another guy who was publishing stuff throughout this time in 1920 was also Claude McKay. He published the poem "Spring in New Hampshire," and this is a poem basically stating that he wants people to get outside, and he thinks that they should be more active outside and to experience nature and to experience the beauty of being outdoors and such like that. And a lot of people still find this poem relevant today just because of its message, message that he was trying to send in 1920. Also, another huge event in 1920 was the UNIA holds its first convention of Negroes people of the world. And this convention, over 2,000 delegates from 22 countries attended, and the convention adopted the Declaration of Rights of Negro People of the World, one of the earliest and most comprehensive documents for human rights. And this will lead us into 1921.
Oh, so 1921 was a huge year. It was kind of I like to think of it as I once heard like a musical year. The Black Swan Phonograph Corporation was founded by Harry Pace, and they produced the race records. One of the people that they promoted the recordings of, her name was Bessie Smith, American blues singer. She had a very beautiful voice. She's unquestionably one of the greatest of the blues singers. Her emotional intensity, her performances, her personal involvement, her expression of just the meaning of her songs, just how beautiful she sang them. Everyone was in love with them. Some of her works that or the song she sang was Baby Doll and After You've Gone. Along with that, her broad phrasing, just the way she sang her music was just unbelievable. Many people fell in love with it. She made almost 200 recordings of jazz blues, singing in the 1920s. And yeah, so along with that, what happened in 1921 was that Langston Hughes wrote the poem "The Negro Speaks of Rivers" and published it in the Crisis. Now, how this poem actually came about is pretty interesting. So he was going to he was on a train and he was going to Mexico to live with his father for a year. And he was just thinking back, and he wanted to write this poem and dedicate it to the hard work African Americans, or the difficulties they went to and what they did. He's one of the most so he dedicated this poem to W.E.B. Du Bois, who he looked at as one of the most brilliant scholars, activists during that year. And basically, what the poem does, "The Negro Speaks of Rivers," is that it connects the soul and heritage of the African American communities to great rivers in other parts of the world, in that it charts the journey of African Americans and Africans in how they kind of led to the birth of their own civilization. The speaker tells the tale of freedom and enslavement, and that his people have endured, and how they're very strong and have a lot of strength, and they basically can't get turned down. Whatever they want, they go for. Very powerful poem. Also, this year, what happened was, like I said, Marcus Garvey came back, and then he finds the African Orthodox Church in September, which was exemplary, and many people were stunned by it. But that's what happened, and that leads us into 1922.
Okay, so for 1922, one of the biggest things that happened during this year was the UNIA, the NAACP, and the YMCA. They did a march in support of Congressman Dyer's anti-lynching act, and this is kind of like a jumpstart for. It was actually a really important moment for the anti-lynching act to go through, and they were really pushing for this act super hard, preferably in southern states where lynching was more commonly used. And another big idea that was happening in 1922 was kind of like the jumpstart of African American art and artistry, and this is where the Harmon Foundation was established to promote Black fine artists. And the Harmon Foundation was founded by real estate and philanthropist William Harmon, who was white but was very intrigued by African American art and literature, and he kind of wanted to show the achievements in visual arts and styles that African Americans had, because he thought he was so intrigued by them and he thought they were very interesting. And what's it called? So this is the end for 1922.
Okay, so jumping into 1923, let's talk about. This was a year I like to talk about Duke Ellington, one of the greatest American composers. He was like a huge reason that whites started listening to jazz music. He's one of, like, I guess you could say, creators of jazz music. He's the one that kind of brought it to the Americas. Now, what happened was he was part of a group called the Washingtonians, and he later turned this group into what's known as Duke Ellington's Orchestra, which everyone knows about. Now, what happened in 1923 was when the Cotton Club was formed. Now, the Cotton Club was a cabaret, one of the largest cabarets, one of the most famous, largest cabarets. Everyone knows about it. That happened, and basically, what it was it was initially a whites-only establishment, and it featured many great African American entertainers, such as Cab Calloway, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong, someone we're going to talk about later, but he was a great one. And going back to Duke Ellington, so just a little history about him, because he has a kind of an interesting history. So he was born in D.C. And basically he based himself in New York City in the 1920s, and just saw orchestra as a way to express himself, to show his intensity. He had a huge passion for it. And he worked with many great people, and just basically showed what could happen. Now, that same year, another great thing happened, where Gene Toomer publishes his novel Cain. Now, Gene Toomer is of a mixed race. He isn't fully black or fully white, and he didn't like to refer to himself as African American or anything, just American. Now, his novel is very interesting, Cain, because not many people liked his novel. Like he said, African Americans didn't want to get it because the whites wouldn't buy it, but the African Americans didn't want to read it until later, where it's now known as one of the greatest novels. But initially, wasn't very appreciative because of how it depicted. It showed the basically stayed in Georgia, just like because he was raised there and grew up there, just how it was like and the troubles that African American women would go through if they went against the social norms, like a white woman gets two black children. It's a completely bad. Society likes to isolate them. Just the horrors and like the tragedies and just how harsh everyone reacted to different things that African Americans would get involved with. Um, Now, Jessie Fawcett's also a great person that comes up in this time, and where she publishes There Is Confusion, and it's the first Harlem Renaissance book by a female writer. Very great. It basically stunned the world, and this leads me into 1924.
Okay, so in 1924, the Civic Club dinner, um, by opportunity on March 21st, to bring black writers and white publishers together, and this was like a big moment because they wanted African Americans and whites to like kind of in to get together and like collaborate their work with publishers, so like more people would know about African American writings, and this was things that happened was County Cullen wins the first prize as the Whitterbrier Poetry Competition. W. Du Bois' The Gift of Black Folk is published, and Jessie Fawcett's The Confusion is also published, as Ahmad mentioned earlier. And this was kind of like the thing that all made it happen was this civic club dinner, what's it called, that wanted to bring the white publishers together with black artists. During 1924, another huge event that kind of happened in relating to music, well, as we were saying earlier, was Louis Armstrong joins Fletcher Henderson's orchestra, publishing in the Roseland Ballroom. And okay, so Louis Armstrong was a jazz musician. He was very popular during the Harlem Renaissance. He played at a lot of famous places, particularly for white individuals. And he joined Fletcher Henderson's orchestra, the most popular African American band in the 1920s. What's it called? The orchestra was a huge influence on swing style and the next decade of like style of music. The orchestra played at the Club Alabama on West 44th Street in New York in 1922 to July of 1924, and then moved to the Roseland Ballroom. And this will lead us into 1925.
Okay, so from now on, we're going to not be talking about specific years, but what happened as like what progressed through the Harlem Renaissance from 1920 forward to the 1940, where arguably the Harlem Renaissance ended. So in during this period, many publications were happening. Like County Cullen was a great figure in this time. That County Cullen was perhaps the most representative voice of the Harlem Renaissance. He, in view of America's racial climate during the 1920s, Harlem was scarcely a serene place, but it was an emotionally stimulating place for African American intellectuals, and this is where County Cullen comes in place, where he basically came in and did a lot of work. He had informal education, but was shaped by black ideas and yearnings, and basically he was influenced by black and whites, and he just brought what knowledge he had and just shocked the world with his great pieces of work. One of the pieces of work which he published was The Colors. Along with that, what happened through the years, color was Wallace Thurman moves to New York from LA. Now, Wallace Thurman was a huge individual, and one of the works that he wrote about was The Blacker the Berry. Do you want to go into that a little bit, The Blacker the Berry?
Okay, so for The Blacker the Berry, it's basically a story that portrays the main character, Emma Lou, and how she goes about through her life, and basically the problem she has dealing with racism through her whole life. And basically, it's kind of like an internal battle for herself. She goes through life growing up in Boise, Idaho, where she's discriminated against because of her darker skin color. Even aspects of her family treat her in very undisrespectful ways just because of her skin color. So then she leaves to go to California, where she thinks it's going to be different, and most people aren't going to be like concerned about her skin color. They're going to be more concerned about other things going on in California, but that wasn't the case for her. So she leaves California and then moves on to Harlem, and in Harlem is where she kind of like gets some breakthroughs for what's going on. Basically, like she meets all different types of people, works for different types of people, and eventually starts to establish herself as like an individual with accepting herself and for her color. But this is something she struggles with throughout the entire book of The Black or the Berry. And kind of like, basically, the whole meaning of the book is to accept yourself for who you are, and that Emma Lou should stop running away from these problems, because that's what she finally realizes at the end, that this is something she's done her entire life. She's run away from men, she's run away from problems with discrimination, she's run away from jobs, and she doesn't want to do that anymore. And this is the realization she has at the end of The Black or the Berry. And this book was real relevant during the Harlem Renaissance, and real popular because it finally told the story of like African American women and the problems that they were going through, and the problems that they were like dealing with internally through like being what's it called, the consideration or the stereotype that light skinned is always better.
Yeah, just to add something, everyone knew about the just like how discrimination between interracial groups like whites and blacks, but no one knew about the intra or in like inside one race. How even inside one race, a darker skin color put you inferior, gave you less benefits, less opportunities, less freedoms than if you were of a lighter skin color, like what they call light skin females had more rights. They got to do more things than dark skinned females, and they basically they were just looked at as better people. Now, another interesting thing that I remember from The Black or the Berry was how the Emmylou's grandmother says, "I wish you were born a dark black man instead of a dark black girl," because what happens is if that dark black man wants to marry a white girl, he'll be more into society, more succinct into it than if she marries someone else, because of how it works out. And yeah, so that's about Black or the Berry. Do you want to add anything else?
For Black or the Berry, I think we're good. Okay, so we kind of want to talk about the short-lived literary magazine Fire, which was published by people like Langston Hughes, Wallace Thurman, Zora Neale Hurston, and it had illustrations by people like Aaron Douglas and Robert Nugent. And this specific magazine kind of didn't get that great of popularity, simply because the black community found it very offensive, and they didn't like the way it depicted Black Harlem and the way Black people were wanted to be presented. They kind of disapproved the content relating to prostitution and homosexuality, which they considered degrading in the aspects of race. They they also thought that there were a lot of throwback old stereotypes, and that what's it called? This was kind of like things happening because of like this, because of the South having these stereotypes, and they didn't want this. They wanted to get away from it. So this is kind of why this piece of literature, Fire, didn't really make it that great in the time of the Harlem Renaissance, because a lot of people didn't want to be depicted in this specific way. They wanted to be depicted in another way, and Fire was just not doing this. So the next piece of literature that we want to talk to about is Home to Harlem. And Home to Harlem was written by Claude McKay, and this was a really popular book and real influential book during the Harlem Renaissance, simply for reasons like it follows this main character, Jake. And Jake joins the army, and while in the army, he really thinks it's going to be different than his life back in the U.S. He thinks that he's going to get opportunities being in the army, because it's like a sense of equality throughout, or it's supposed to be a sense of equality. But once he actually gets into the army and goes and fights, he finds out that he's kind of treated as like the lower class of the military in a way. Like he gets the dirty jobs and jobs that he really doesn't want do, and this like kind of like upsets him because he wanted it to be so different, and this is exactly what's he didn't want, and this is exactly why he left, basically to go into the army to get this freedom, to get away from this racism. But it's kind of just coming back to haunt him. And when he comes back to the U.S. is when he kind of like has different moments of realization, and this is where Ahmad's going to talk to you about.
Okay, so another thing, so when he comes here, a big theme that comes up is something called primitivism. Now, primitivism is Claude McKay's idea of instinct over reason. So, not making logical decisions, sorry, but making a more instinctual kind of what you are feeling over emotional decisions over logical decisions. Like when Jake comes to back to New York, he spends money everywhere. Wherever he goes, he just throws money around, doesn't care about it, drinks every night, takes drugs, spends it on women, prostitutes, doesn't really care about any of the results or any of the outcomes of what his decisions are doing, which means not making logical decisions, but doing them because he's just like self-interested and he wants it temporarily, which is what primitivism is about, instinct over reason. Now, this is a huge thing that McKay brought up. Claude McKay really showed what some people were like, and it the novel basically showed the nightmares and the negativity present in Harlem, what most people were either hidden to, didn't know about, knew about, but didn't want to talk about. And it was something great that many look at the book as, wow, this Claude McKay really showed the negativity, the harshness, the nightmare lifestyle that Harlem was, and it really brought it to the attention of white people and black people. White people grabbed the novel just as much as black people, and they enjoyed it, read about it, informed themselves about what Harlem was about. So it was a great novel.
Okay, so
Another interesting person to talk about that I'm going to talk about right now, his name was Archibald Motley, and his paintings are exhibited at new galleries in New York. He was a great figure. What happened was he's an African American painter. He studied at the School of Art Institute of Chicago during 1910, graduated in 1918. He's most famous for his colorful chronicling of the African American experience during the 1920s and 1930s, and is considered one of the major contributors to the Harlem Renaissance, or the New Negro movement, like Alan Locke likes to call it, a time in which African American art reached new heights, as it not just in New York but across America, even reached France and England. Many people were interested in African American art. They were really making a breakthrough. Like, this was the Harlem Renaissance. Their everything about their culture, their art, music. It was making a revolution. People were finding out about it. It was spreading. Now, just to talk about his colorful chronicling of the African American experience, great piece of art. Honestly, I love it. It really just shows you what African Americans went through, the positivity that comes out of it, and he was just a great artist overall.
So another what's it called important artist that we want to talk about in the during the Harlem Renaissance was the painter Jacob Lawrence. And Jacob Lawrence was an African American painter known for his portrayal of African American life. Lawrence referred to his style as dynamic Cubanism. Though by his account the primary influence was not so much French as French art as shaped as the colors of Harlem. Lawrence was best known in the 20th century for his paintings. He gained recognition when he was just 23 years old, and he gained recognition for his migration series, which was paintings that he did on cardboard. And the series depicted the Great Migration of African Americans from rural South to the urban North. This series is really interesting because it showed a lot of what African Americans went through in this kind of migration, and he kind of painted in this specific style that a lot of people liked and a lot of people found interesting, and they were very intrigued by it, and they wanted to see more of his work, and they really liked the series that he did, The Great Migration. Even Fortune magazine even published some of this work in 1941 for him to kind of gain recognition. Okay, so the last artist we want to talk about is Aaron Douglas. And we kind of touched on Aaron Douglas a little bit earlier when we told that he did illustrations for the magazine The Fire. But Aaron Douglas also did a lot of illustrations for the the works The Crisis and The Opportunity during the Harlem Renaissance. Aaron Douglas was real influential during the Harlem Renaissance because his illustrations were very popular and a lot of people liked him. He even studied with Wilnad Rennis, who was the German artist who worked on on Alan Locke's illustrations in The New Negro. And Douglas was heavily influenced by African culture that he painted for. His natural talent, plus his newly acquired inspiration from Douglas, sorry, not from Douglas, allowed Douglas to be considered the father of African American arts. The title led him to say, "Do not call me the father of African American arts. I am just the son of Africa, and I paint what inspires me." So Aaron Douglas, well, he had a lot of good works, good illustrations, and he was very important to his age because he gave people a lot of visuals for what the writings were trying to portray and what the message that we're trying to get across. So working together with the writers, I feel like Aaron Douglas is very important during the Harlem Renaissance.
So just to sum it up, I just want to give my last thoughts. So, like I said, the Harlem Renaissance was a period of great cultural, economic, and identity assertion among talented expression African Americans. Along with that, I think it was a larger movement, as in it fit in. It kind of destroyed some stereotypes, created newer ones, better ones, more improved ones, more progressive ones. It really helped the African American community out. The Harlem Renaissance was when people got aware of the talents that were inside African Americans that were often overshadowed or not looked at or people weren't interested in. And I just find that studying the Harlem Renaissance was a great experience. Had a lot of fun, learned a lot of things. Just shows how brutal at one point the treatment of African Americans was, and how they themselves, without any help, built themselves out of it and created something that everyone can look at as an astonishing thing. And it's true. Do you have any last thing?
Just like to say pretty much the same stuff. Like just the Harlem Renaissance was a great period of time. It kind of made me realize a lot of stuff about African American culture and where it comes from, and where African Americans like wanted to pursue themselves in specific areas, and how they wanted to fight against these acts of racism and acts of prejudice and acts of separation.
So thank you, and that's our video.